So welcome everyone to this discussion group. This is like the second in a series that OPP is putting on this term on South Asian philosophy. And so if you want to find out more about OPP, there's a link to our Facebook page in the Facebook event, so you can have a look at that. And so today we'll be talking about Sri Ramakrishna and the harmony of religions. And we're very grateful to have Swami Medhananda with us today. So I'll just briefly introduce Swami. Swami Medhananda is assistant professor and head of the Department of Philosophy at the Ramakrishna Mission at the Vivekananda University in Belur Math. He received his doctorate from UC Berkeley, and he also studied at Oxford University and at Humboldt-Universität in Berlin. He specializes in Vedāntic philosophical traditions, cross-cultural philosophy of religion, and Indian scriptural hermeneutics. His current research focuses on Vedāntic philosophical traditions, cross-cultural philosophy of religion, Indian scriptural hermeneutics, and philosophies of Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Vivekananda, and Sri Aurobindo. He is a section editor at the International Journal of Hindu Studies, overseeing submissions in Hindu cross-cultural philosophy of religion. Some of his works include Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, Sri Ramakrishna, and Cross-Cultural Philosophy of Religion, which is a kind of the work that he'll be expanding on today, I believe. And the edited volume, the Bloomsbury Research Handbook of Vedanta, which was published last year. He also has a range of essays on philosophical topics, including like explorations of Ezra Pound's poetry to comparisons between Hegel and Sri Harsha, loads of really fascinating stuff. And that can all be accessed on his academia.edu website. So thank you so much, Swami, for being here. And thank you everyone for showing up. And yeah, I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you so much, Amir. And thank you to Shrutakirti as well for inviting me to speak to you today. Let me try to share my screen and we can begin. Okay, so hopefully you can see my presentation. Yes? Excellent. All right. I'll be speaking today on what I think is a very, very important theme for contemporary times. You know, if you just open up a newspaper on any given day, you'll usually find that some kind of atrocity or act of violence has been committed in the name of religion. And it's quite troubling, and it seems to be getting worse rather than better. And so one of the major questions that confronts us is there a way to appreciate the harmony of all religions? And I think that Sri Ramakrishna has a great deal to contribute to answering that question. So that's what I'll be talking about today. So I think you're probably aware, sorry, let me just, that Sri Ramakrishna was a 19th century Hindu mystic who lived in West Bengal, and he's probably most famous for the sheer range of spiritual and religious practices that he underwent, and the sheer range of spiritual experiences that he had as a result of all of these different kinds of sadhanas or spiritual practices. So he practiced not only Tantra, but also Vaishnavism and also Advaita Vedanta, which is a non-theistic tradition within Hinduism. But even more remarkably, he practiced Islam for a brief period and then had a vision of a realization of Allah. And he practiced Christianity and had a vision of Jesus actually merging into his body. So it's very unusual and interesting, the sort of range of his experiences. And on the basis of his varied sadhanas and spiritual experiences, he taught famously the harmony of all religions. So one of his famous teachings is, as many faiths, so many paths. The original Bangla is Math Path. And there are other ways he puts it. We'll be discussing some of the other formulations later. But so he very clearly and uncontroversially taught the harmony of all religions. All the different faiths are so many paths leading to God. But that's, you know, one simple statement, but I think there's a lot of philosophical depth and subtlety behind that. And what I'll try to do today is explain what he understood to be the philosophical underpinnings of the harmony of all religions. How did he explain the harmony of all religions? That's the question which I'll be exploring today. To help us in understanding his views, I find very helpful a threefold typology introduced by the Christian theologian Alan Race a number of decades ago in 1983. So he introduced these three terms, and I'll just explain the terms. So exclusivism is the view that, I should just mention this briefly. Actually, different scholars have defined and interpreted these three different terms in many different ways. I'm giving you my version of it, which I think is most helpful in the context of discussing Sri Ramakrishna. So exclusivism is the view that my religion alone leads to salvation. All other religions don't lead to salvation. They can either lead to a hell or they just, something else. But so in parentheses, I gave one example, the Protestant theologian Karl Barth. He endorsed exclusivism. So he claimed that only Protestant Christianity leads to salvation. Other views are just wrong and they don't lead to salvation. There's a middle position called inclusivism, which holds that only one religion leads directly to salvation, but other religions lead indirectly to salvation or afford lesser forms of salvation. So one example on the Christian side is Karl Rahner, a Catholic theologian who is famous for developing this idea of what he called anonymous Christians. So the idea is that Christians practice kind of the highest religion, but those who are non-Christian also will eventually attain salvation because they are anonymous Christians. They're Christians without knowing it. So you can see how there's a kind of inclusivistic element to that. He doesn't put non-Christian religions on the same footing as Christianity, but he nonetheless does not dismiss them as wrong or as completely not leading to salvation in the way that exclusivists do. And on the Indian side, I wanted to give one example of inclusivism. I note Advaita Vedanta is an inclusivist philosophy. I'll explain why in the next two slides. So that's kind of, I'll just explain that in a bit. And the third view is called pluralism. So religious pluralism. This is the view that multiple religions equally lead to salvation. So I hope you can see how this differs from inclusivism. Whereas inclusivism kind of has a hierarchy where they put one religion at the top and others kind of a little below it, at least a little below it. Pluralism puts different religions on an equal footing. And some examples from Christianity include John Hick, the British philosopher, Paul Knitter, who's still living, and I'll be discussing today Sri Ramakrishna. And I'm going to be arguing that Sri Ramakrishna championed a really distinctive and really robust form of religious pluralism. Okay, but I promised that I'd be discussing briefly why I think that Advaita Vedanta is inclusivist. So to understand why, we first need to have a little bit of an understanding of what the philosophy of Advaita Vedanta is. So Shankaracharya, Shankara for short, was an 8th century Indian philosopher. And he was the one who codified this philosophy of Advaita Vedanta by writing extended Sanskrit commentaries on the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, and the Brahma Sutra. And in one of the classical Advaitic texts, which people traditionally attribute to him, but which was most likely written by a follower of Advaita after his time, called the Viveka-Chudamani, we get this formula, which really captures in a nutshell the entire Advaitic philosophy. Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya Jivo Brahmaeva Naparaha. And the translation would be, Brahman alone is real, the world is unreal, the individual is none other than Brahman. So if we put those into kind of doctrines, we can say that the first doctrine of Advaita Vedanta is that the sole reality is Brahman, which Advaita Vedantas understand as non-dual pure consciousness. And it's important that Brahman here is impersonal. It's not personal. The second doctrine, the world, the personal God, in Sanskrit the term is Ishvara, and individual souls, the Sanskrit term is Jiva, are all empirically real, but ultimately unreal. So this is also a really important metaphysical doctrine in Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. He makes a distinction between two levels of reality, an empirical level, which is called the Vyavaharika level, and the ultimate level, which is called the Paramatika level. So the only thing which is ultimately real is Brahman, and everything else has a kind of provisional reality, but ultimately it's all unreal. The world, the loving personal God, each one of us as individuals, Amir or Swami Medhananda, etc. We're all, none of this is real from the ultimate standpoint. Third doctrine, we attain liberation, the Sanskrit term here is moksha, by attaining knowledge of our true nature as Brahman. So that's that last part of that formula. Jivo brahmeva naparaha. Each one of us is none other than that one ultimate reality, Brahman. Now, what does that mean for spiritual practice? That's where doctrines 4 and 5 come in. According to Advaita Vedanta, Jnana Yoga, the yoga of knowledge, is the only direct path to liberation. What is the yoga of knowledge? In short, it's hearing a mahavakya, that's the Sanskrit term. It's a great saying taken from the Upanishad, which tells you that you are none other than Brahman. Tattvam asi, for instance, is one of the great sayings. You hear that, I am Brahman, from a qualified guru. You reflect on that teaching, and then you meditate on that teaching. And ideally, if your mind is sufficiently pure, you instantaneously attain the knowledge of Brahman, your true nature. So according to Advaita Vedanta, this is the only direct path to liberation. But here's doctrine 5, and here's where I hope you can start to see the inclusivist flavor of Advaita Vedanta. What Sankara says is, Sankara and his followers, they don't dismiss other kinds of spiritual paths. What they say is that paths like bhakti yoga, the yoga of devotion, so devotion toward a personal God, and karma yoga, the yoga of unselfish action, lead indirectly to liberation by purifying and concentrating our minds, thereby making us eligible to practice jnana yoga. So this is clearly hierarchical, right? So you get, it's actually, the Sanskrit term here is krama samanvaya. So Sankara harmonizes the different spiritual practices, but in a hierarchical way, where he puts jnana yoga at the top, saying that jnana yoga alone leads directly to salvation. Other spiritual practices like bhakti yoga, karma yoga are also valid, but they can only lead indirectly by making you kind of eligible to practice the highest spiritual practice, which is jnana yoga. Okay. Now, with that in the background, let's now look at how I take Advaita Vedantins to harmonize the world's religions in an inclusivist manner. This is one of the standard tropes for understanding the harmony of religions, but let's see how Sankara would do it. So look, obviously in Shankara's time, he's not interested in non-Hindu religions. He didn't even talk about them. But more modern Advaita Vedantas like Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan and Swami Vivekananda and others, they kind of expand Advaita Vedanta to accommodate non-Hindu religions. So that's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking more of a kind of modern kind of Advaita Vedanta, grounded in Shankara's premises. So according to this kind of modern Advaitins, what they would say is that Christians, through the practice of the Christian religion, will be able to attain the realization or the knowledge of their Christian God. Muslims, through the practice of Islam, will realize God as Allah. Theistic Hindus will realize God in the particular form that they worship God in or as. So for instance, as Rama or as Krishna, as Kali, as Shiva, and so on and so on. But notice that none of them reach the top of the mountain. Why is that? Because according to Advaita Vedanta, the realization of different forms of the personal God, which in Sanskrit is called Saguna Brahman, Brahman with qualities, is not sufficient for liberation. That's not tantamount to salvation. You need to do something more. What is that something more? The Christian needs to leave off his Christian practice, accept the truth of Advaita Vedanta as the highest teaching, and then practice Jnana Yoga, and then alone that Christian religious practitioner can attain the ultimate goal of merging his or her individuality in non-dual Brahman, which is moksha. Likewise for Muslims, likewise for theistic Hindus. Okay, so I hope it's clear even diagrammatically how this is an inclusivist kind of harmonizing. Non-Advaitic religious paths or spiritual philosophies can take us part of the way, but not all the way. That's the idea. Now, the interesting thing is that when we study Sri Ramakrishna's teachings on the harmony of religions, different scholars have different views on how Sri Ramakrishna harmonized the world religions. I discuss this in detail in chapter 3 of my book, and I'm just giving a kind of very brief summary here. But it's interesting that some scholars actually claim that he harmonized the world religions basically within the framework of Advaitic inclusivism, along the lines of this slide. So he also, what these scholars will say is that he basically followed Shankara, and he believed that Advaita Vedanta is the highest philosophy, and he also accepted non-Advaitic religions, but he put them on a kind of slightly lower footing. I think that that's a seriously mistaken interpretation of Sri Ramakrishna's views. And in chapter 3, I kind of develop an argument, an alternative interpretation of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings, which make him out to be a really hardcore religious pluralist. And that's what I'll be trying to explain in the remainder of this lecture. So just keep in mind in the background what I take to be the traditional Advaitic inclusivist way of harmonizing the world's religion, just as a way of kind of setting into relief how I think Sri Ramakrishna does it differently. So to understand the uniqueness of Sri Ramakrishna's views, I think what's absolutely essential are his teachings on two essential stages of spiritual experience, which he calls jnana and vijñana. So jnana in Bengali and Sanskrit means knowledge, and what he means is knowledge of Brahman, of the impersonal, non-dual Brahman. And vijñana, so in Sanskrit, when you add the prefix vi to a word, in this context especially, it acts as an intensifier. So in this context, vijñana means a deeper or more intimate knowledge of God. So this is what he says about these two stages in spiritual experience. The jnani gives up his identification with worldly things, discriminating not this, not this. The Sanskrit here is neti, neti. Only then can he realize Brahman. It is like reaching the roof of a house by leaving the steps behind one by one. But the vijñani, who is more intimately acquainted with Brahman, realizes something more. He realizes that the steps are made of the same materials as the roof: bricks, lime, and brick dust. That which is realized as Brahman through the eliminating process of not this, is then found to have become the universe and all its living beings. The vijñani sees that the reality which is impersonal, so the Bengali here is nirguna, is also personal, saguna. This is known as vijñana. So I think this is a really pregnant teaching and it's worth unpacking. So what is the jnani? The person who attains this first stage in spiritual experience? He is the person, according to Sri Ramakrishna, who follows Sankara's Advaita Vedanta, which I just explained in the previous slides. This person attains the spiritual realization of the impersonal, nirguna, non-dual Brahman. Otherwise, we can also call it pure consciousness, through the practice of Jnana Yoga. That's what he referred to as neti neti, saying that this world is not this, this is nothing. My body is not this Brahman. My mind is not this Brahman, right? So it's a very negative kind of practice. Through that, he attains a state of nirvikalpa samadhi, in which he realized that he is none other than that non-dual pure consciousness. Now, the vijñani goes beyond the Advaita jnani by realizing that Brahman is not only impersonal, but also personal, also saguna. So Brahman is not only the impersonal pure consciousness, but also the personal God known as Shakti. Sri Ramakrishna will often refer to the personal God as Shakti. And that's a very important concept in Kashmiri Shaivism and Tantra traditions. And he also notes that while the jnani dismisses the world as a framework of illusion, the Bengali here is dhoka tati, the vijñani embraces the universe as what he calls a mansion of mirth, mojarputi. Why? Because he sees that there's nothing but God. God has become everything in this world. So it's a form of, we can call it a kind of panentheism if we want to use a Western term. Okay, so keep this in mind. And on the basis of the spiritual experience of vijñana, Sri Ramakrishna taught, I think, a very unique and expansive philosophy, which I coined this term, I call it Vijñana-Vedanta, to distinguish it from Advaita Vedanta and from other Vedantic traditions, like Vishishta Advaita Vedanta or Advaita Vedanta or Achintya Bheda Vedanta. So I go into great detail. I explain Vijñana-Vedanta in detail in chapter 1 of my book. So if anyone's interested, they can look at, they can read chapter 1. I'm just giving you a very, very brief overview. So the first doctrine of his Vijñana-Vedanta is that the sole reality is the infinite divine reality, which is the impersonal, non-dual Brahman in one aspect, and the personal God, Shakti, in another aspect. So one of his favorite teachings in Bangla is Brahma Ashokti Abhed. So Brahman here means the non-dual pure consciousness, and Shakti here means the personal God who is also responsible for creating, preserving, and destroying this universe. And he's claiming that the personal God and the impersonal Brahman are just different but equally real aspects of one and the same infinite divine reality. So that's the first key tenet of his Vijñana-Vedanta. Going back to, if you recall, the slides on Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, so how does that differ from Shankara's philosophy? Can you think about it? Can anyone say how this first tenet differs from Shankara's Advaita Vedanta? Amir? Okay, I don't want to put anyone on the spot.
Well, I mean, I might say that it's sort of a difference of ontology, perhaps.
Yeah, correct, yeah.
Yeah, so that these are both ontologically valid, and there's not sort of like an emanationism, whereas for Shankara, the impersonal is sort of the most ontological, like the most accurate way of speaking.
Correct. It's, yeah, according to Shankara, remember from the slide, the impersonal Brahman alone is ultimately real, right? Sri Ramakrishna is saying both Brahman and the personal God are ultimately real. He doesn't even make a distinction between ultimate and empirical levels of reality like traditional Advaitas. So that's the first tenet. Second tenet, the world and all individual souls are real manifestations of Shakti, of the personal God. Here again, it should be obvious how this second tenet differs from Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. Remember that Shankara teaches that Jagat is mithya, the world is ultimately unreal. Shankara says, no, actually, if we accept that the infinite reality is not just impersonal, but also personal, we can also see this entire world as a real manifestation of Shakti, of the personal God. So we don't dismiss it as unreal, we accept it as a real manifestation of God. Third tenet, Jnana Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Karma Yoga, and Raja Yoga. Raja Yoga is a term that I didn't introduce before, but it's a yoga of meditation based on, well, it's arguable what it's based on, but anyway, it comes close to Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. All of these different spiritual practices are direct paths to the goal of God realization. Here again, I hope you notice the difference between this third tenet of Sri Ramakrishna's Vijñana-Vedanta and Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. Remember that according to Shankaracharya, Jnana Yoga alone is a direct and independent path to liberation. And other paths like Bhakti Yoga and Karma Yoga are acceptable and they're valid, except that they only lead indirectly to salvation and not directly. Whereas here, Sri Ramakrishna claims that all four, and all the different religions, as we'll see, are all direct paths leading to the same goal of God realization. So there's no hierarchy of spiritual practices in the way that you find in Shankara and his followers. Okay, with that in the background, that philosophical backdrop, we can now, I think, understand the subtlety of Sri Ramakrishna's doctrine of religious pluralism. So, at the basis of Sri Ramakrishna's religious pluralism is his Vijñana-based ontology of the impersonal, personal, infinite reality. And he has many, many teachings to explain the harmony of religions, but my absolute favorite is this one, which is God is infinite and the paths to God are infinite. And that's also why I called my book Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality. It's based on this teaching. This is the epigraph to my book. The original Bangla is Tini Ananto Potho Ananto. And the reason why I like this teaching more than some of his other teachings, like Math, Path, which means as many faiths, so many paths. Infinite paths, infinite doctrines is another one of his paths, another one of his teachings. This one is unique, I think. The reason it's unique is because he not only explains that all the different religions are different paths leading to God, but he gives the rationale. He gives the reason why they're infinite paths leading to God. The reason is the first clause here, God is infinite. It's because God is infinite that there are infinite paths leading to God. In what sense is God infinite? It's what I just explained in the previous slide, which is that because God is not just personal, he's not just Christ, he's not just Allah, he's not just Krishna, he's not just Nirguna Brahman, he's not just Shunyata or Nirvana, but he's all of that. So God is the infinite divine reality, both personal and impersonal, and can assume infinite form. So another one of his favorite teachings is Bhagavan kono iti ne. And iti is a Sanskrit term, which was taken into Bangla, which means it's like an end quotation mark in a Sanskrit sentence or in a Bengali sentence. So he's saying you can never put an end to God. You can never say that God is only this and not this. So it's because God is infinite that there's an equally or correspondingly infinite number of paths leading to God. And for the remainder of my presentation, I'll just be kind of unpacking the philosophical depths of that teaching. And I think one of the best parables that he gives to explain this teaching is the parable of the chameleon. You'll find that if you read the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, or the original Bangla is Sri Ramakrishna Kathamrita, it's full of parables. Very much like if you read Jesus Christ's teachings, they're also full of parables. You'll find that many of these great masters in different traditions, they use parables to explain really lofty spiritual ideas. So here's his parable of the chameleon. Once a man entered a forest and saw a small animal on a tree. He came back and told another man that he had seen a creature of a beautiful red color on a certain tree. The second man replied, when I went into the forest, I also saw that animal, but why do you call it red? It is green. Another man who was present contradicted them both and insisted that it was yellow. Presently, others arrived and contended that it was gray, violet, blue, and so forth and so on. At last, they started quarreling among themselves. To settle the dispute, they all went to the tree. They saw a man sitting under it. So there's a really unusual man who's actually sitting under the tree, which is funny. Anyway, on being asked, he replied, yes, I live under this tree and I know the animal very well. All your descriptions are true. Sometimes it appears red, sometimes yellow, and at other times blue, violet, gray, and so forth. It is a chameleon. And sometimes it has no color at all. Now it has a color and now it has none. In like manner, so now it's Sri Ramakrishna explaining the meaning of this parable. In like manner, one who constantly thinks of God can know God's real nature. He alone knows that God reveals himself to seekers in various forms and aspects. God is personal as well as impersonal. Only the man who lives under the tree knows that the chameleon can appear in various colors, and he knows further that the animal at times has no color at all. It is the others who suffer from the agony of futile argument. Now, I want to bring your attention to two key features of this parable. One is, notice that the chameleon can assume different colors like blue, violet, gray, right? These are some of the ones mentioned, but what do those correspond to? What do those colors correspond to in this parable? If we think about the nature of God, can any of you think about that? Make a suggestion there. Doesn't have to be a mirror, but anyway, okay. Anyway, but basically it could be, blue could be Christ, violet could be Kali, gray could be Allah, you take your pick of maybe different forms of the personal God, for instance. But what about the chameleon not having a color at all? How about that? Amir or anyone else? Can you think of what does a colorless chameleon correspond to in Sri Ramakrishna's parable?
Does anyone else want to have a go? It seems to me that perhaps it's about like an impersonal God, maybe.
Great, I think that's absolutely right. Exactly. So this is what the colorless chameleon corresponds to, what Sri Ramakrishna calls Brahman, or the impersonal, non-dual, pure consciousness, what the Advaita Vedantins meditate on, and arguably what some Buddhist schools also think about in different ways. Okay, so that's the first feature of this parable. But the second one is, who is the man? It could also be a woman, it doesn't matter, who's sitting under this tree, who's there all along, who sees the chameleon in different colors, but also is colorless. Who does that person sitting under the tree correspond to in Sri Ramakrishna's teachings? Can you think about that? Do you have any ideas?
You can put it in the chat if you don't want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, but does anyone, I can't even see the chat, but anyway. Okay, can anyone guess? This is the $1 million, who is the man sitting under the tree? Within the framework of Sri Ramakrishna's Vijñana-Vedanta, yeah.
Got an answer from Ayushi Gupta saying a priest, maybe? So someone perhaps.
That's interesting. Okay, well, okay. I mean, that's not my answer. It could be, but my suggestion is that the person sitting under the tree is the Vijñana, the one who enjoys the spiritual experience of Vijñana. Because remember from a few slides back that when Sri Ramakrishna explains the state of Vijñana, he says that the Vijñana is the one who realizes that God is not just impersonal, but also personal. So he is really, this is a very unique kind of spiritual experience or spiritual realization, where instead of seeing or realizing God only as impersonal or only as one certain form of the personal God, whether Kali or Krishna or Christ or whatever, you actually see God in different forms and aspects. So on my interpretation, this man sitting under the tree represents the Vijñani. And so I think this parable really nicely explains how the harmony of all religions is grounded in the philosophical standpoint of Vijñana. Okay? Now, we can finally get to how we can think of Sri Ramakrishna's religious pluralism. with the same mountain, but let's see how this differs from Shankara's Advaitic mountain. So what would Sri Ramakrishna say? I think that what Sri Ramakrishna would say is that Christians through Christian practice can directly attain the goal of their religion, their salvation, which for them is, it's however you want to cash it out, and different Christian theologians have different views of thinking about it, but let's call it realization of Christ or eternal love and communion with Christ. Muslims through the practice of Islam will also directly attain their goal of salvation. Hindus, and here I mean theistic Hindus, so Shaktas, Shaivas, Vaishnavas, etc., they will all attain their particular understanding of salvation. So theistic Hindus typically understand salvation as residing in an eternal loka. Loka means like a kind of transcendental realm where you dwell in an eternal loving communion with your chosen deity. So they'll attain that directly through their religious practice. But he also claims that Advaita Vedantins. So he had an Advaita guru named Totapuri. And his guru was an enlightened saint, and he had attained the goal of Brahman. So Sri Ramakrishna says, Advaita Vedantins also can directly attain salvation, how they understand salvation, through their spiritual practice, which is Jnana Yoga. But for them, salvation means something different, right? They don't believe that salvation is dwelling in some kind of heaven with the personal God. They don't accept any of that. What Advaitins say is that salvation is nothing but realizing that we are none other than non-dual pure consciousness. Ramakrishna says, great, you'll get that through your practice directly. And he also says the same thing about Buddhists. Or I think he would say the same thing about, well, he does. That's a separate issue. If you want to ask me in the question and answer period, we can talk about his views on Buddhism. But okay, so I hope you can see just even diagrammatically how this differs from how I take Sri Ramakrishna's harmonizing of the world religions from a religious pluralist standpoint to differ from Shankara's inclusivist Advaitic harmonizing. Here, each of the different religions leads directly to salvation, whereas for Shankara, there was more of a hierarchical pattern where non-Advaitic religions can take you part of the way, but not all the way. Now, so another thing that to keep in mind here, and I can only just broach this topic here, but there are many different forms of religious pluralism. There are many different Western theories of religious pluralism. John Hick is one of the most prominent champions of religious pluralism, but there are others as well. As I said, Paul Nitter was another one, but Raimundo Paniker is another, and there are yet more. Gandhiji was another. Mahatma Gandhi taught religious pluralism. So we shouldn't make the mistake of just kind of saying that, of assuming that there's just a monolithic definition of religious pluralism, that every religious pluralist holds exactly the same view. I think that would be seriously wrong. And I think it's important to try to kind of understand what each particular religious pluralist is saying and what's distinctive about their particular form of religious pluralism. And one of the key questions, or one of the key problems that every religious pluralist has to face is this one, which is the problem of conflicting religious truth claims. And different religious pluralists will answer this question in different ways depending on their framework of religious pluralism. So here's the problem. If different religions make conflicting claims about historical and metaphysical realities, how can all religions be valid? So it's a pretty simple problem. Let me try to just explain it with some examples. So one question, did Christ die on the cross? What do Christians say? Orthodox Christians, pretty much any Christian will say, yes, of course he died on the cross. But what do Muslims say about this? Their view is that Christ did not die on the cross. So they disagree on this. They have conflicting answers to this question. If a religious pluralist says that Christianity and Islam are equally true, doesn't that commit them to the contradiction that Christ did die on the cross and that Christ did not die on the cross? That's the problem. What about with respect to reincarnation? Is reincarnation true? Hindus and Buddhists claim that reincarnation is true. Orthodox Christians and Orthodox Muslims and Orthodox Jews tend to say that reincarnation is not true. So if a religious pluralist claims that Buddhism and Hinduism and Christianity and the other Abrahamic religions are all true, again, aren't they committing themselves to just a blatant contradiction? Aren't they saying that reincarnation is true and that reincarnation isn't true? So how would Sri Ramakrishna respond to this problem of conflicting religious truth claims? The key here is, I think, that Sri Ramakrishna never claimed that all religions are true, but he claimed that all religions are salvifically efficacious. That is, that all religions are effective in leading to salvation. So that's a very, very important distinction to make. If he claimed that all religions are true, I think, or any religious pluralist position which claims that all religions are true, if they just make that kind of blanket statement, they will founder on the shores of this problem of conflicting religious truth claims. The way he kind of sidesteps that problem is to focus on the salvific efficacy of world religions rather than on their doctrinal truth. And let me just try to explain that in a slightly more detail. If you want more details, you can read chapter 3 of my book. To help us here, I think John Hick has provided a helpful classification of 3 different types of conflicting religious truth claims. So the first type is disagreements about past historical events that are in principle accessible to human observation. So one example of that is whether Christ did or did not die on the cross, just as one example. Second kind of conflicting religious truth claim is disagreements about what he calls transhistorical matters, which cannot be verified by historical or other empirical evidence. An example here would be, he claims that reincarnation is an example of this. It's arguable now in 2020 whether we can really say that there's no empirical evidence for reincarnation, because people like Jim Tucker and Ian Stevenson have done interesting work on this and claim that there's strong empirical evidence for reincarnation, but that's a separate issue. But another example of a transhistorical disagreement would be a disagreement about does God incarnate as a human being, for instance. That's something that doesn't seem to be empirically adjudicable, right? And the third type of conflicting religious truth claim, according to John Hick, is disagreements about ultimate questions or about the ultimate reality. What is the nature of ultimate reality? Remember, some religions like Advaita Vedanta claim that the ultimate reality is impersonal. Buddhists claim it's nirvana, or they have strictly negative understandings of the ultimate reality, or they don't accept a ultimate reality at all. And different theistic religions explain the ultimate reality in different ways. Okay, these are 3 different, so keep in mind these 3 different kinds of conflicting truth claims. So how would Sri Ramakrishna, I think that he holds one stance on the first 2 types of conflicting truth claims, the historical and transhistorical religious truth claims. According to Sri Ramakrishna, historical and transhistorical doctrines are not soteriologically vital. That is, even if a religion is wrong about a particular historical or transhistorical issue, that doesn't handicap that religion from a salvific standpoint. Here's his teaching. That yearning, vyakulata or bakulata in Bengali, is the whole thing. Whatever path you follow, whether you are a Hindu, a Muslim, a Christian, a Shakta, a Vaishnava, or a Brahmo, the vital point is yearning. God is our inner guide, antaryami. It doesn't matter if you take a wrong path, only you must be restless for him. God himself will put you on the right path. Besides, there are errors in all paths. Everyone thinks his watch is right. But as a matter of fact, no watch is absolutely right, but that doesn't hamper one's work. So notice here that I like this watch metaphor. The idea is he's likening every religious practitioner to a person wearing a watch. He says no watch is right, which means no religion has a monopoly on doctrinal truth. No religion is 100% correct in its doctrines. But the errors at the historical and transhistorical level don't detract from a religion's, in any serious or significant way, from a religion's salvific efficacy. That's Sri Ramakrishna's main point. What is most important about a religion, or about one's religious practice, is that you need to have a sincere yearning or a kind of sincere aspiration to attain the goal of your particular religious path. That's what he calls vyakulata. Okay. Now, what is the stance toward the third type of conflicting truth claim about ultimate questions about the ultimate reality? He takes a different tack. From the standpoint of Sri Ramakrishna's Vijñana-Vedanta, religious truth claims about the ultimate reality are not actually conflicting, but they are complementary. To explain the complementarity of different religious understandings of the ultimate reality, one of the ways that he explains this is with the parable of the chameleon, which I already explained, but another one of his favorite parables was the parable of the blind man and the elephant, which I assume many of you are familiar with. It's a common one. It's not one that he invented. I mean, it pre-existed him. But he claims that through this parable that each religion captures a unique aspect or form of the impersonal, personal, infinite reality, but that no religion captures the whole of the infinite reality. So what is this parable? He says, one can rightly speak of God only after one has seen him. He who has seen God knows really and truly that God has form and that he is formless as well. He has many other aspects that cannot be described. Once some blind men chanced to come near an elephant. A person explained to them, this animal is an elephant. They were asked what the elephant was like. The blind men began to feel its body. One of them said the elephant was like a pillar. He had touched only its leg. Another said it was like a winnowing fan. He had touched only its ear. In this way, the others, having touched its tail or belly, gave their different versions of the elephant. Just so, a man who has seen only one aspect of God limits God to that alone. It is his conviction that God cannot be anything else. Again, I want you to note a few things here. First of all, just imagine, there are 4 or 5 different blind men, each touching a different part of the elephant. They're both right and wrong, right? They're all right in thinking that the part of the elephant they're touching really is the elephant. They're all wrong in thinking that the part of the elephant that they're touching exhausts the nature of that elephant. And the person with sight is the one who can see that they're all right and that they're all wrong, right? And it can explain to them, well, you're all right because you're all touching different parts of the same elephant. All of your views of the elephant are complementary. They're not conflicting. There's no need to fight with each other. Who is that person with sight? Again, it's the Vijñani, right? It corresponds nicely to the person sitting under the tree in the chameleon parable. It's the person who has a more comprehensive or a more expansive understanding of the nature of God as the infinite divine reality. And finally, I just want to wrap up the presentation by highlighting what I take to be 4 key advantages of Sri Ramakrishna's Vijñana-based religious pluralism. So the first advantage is that it's a really robust form of religious pluralism, as opposed to what you often find, which is that, for instance, I'll just give one example. I don't want to do kind of like picking on people, but there's a prominent Christian theologian named S. Mark Heim, H-E-I-M. He wrote a book called Salvations, where he calls his position religious pluralism, but then he basically comes out and says explicitly, but my religious pluralism is actually an inclusivism. So he starts muddying the waters. And so you'll find that in a lot of cases that even though many people claim that they're religious pluralists, they're often inclusivists in disguise. But in my view, in my interpretation, Sri Ramakrishna's religious pluralism is a really robust pluralism and not an inclusivism. I think that's one virtue of his theory. The second advantage is that since the personal God and the impersonal absolute are different but equally real aspects of one and the same infinite divine reality, theistic and non-theistic religions are placed on an equal ontological footing. So remember, with Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, he ended up putting theistic spiritual practices on a slightly lower footing than his own non-theistic Advaita Vedanta. And theistic religions often do the opposite. Remember, I mentioned the Catholic theologian Karl Rahner, who has this idea of anonymous Christians. He does the same thing in reverse, and he privileges theistic Christianity and specifically Catholicism over non-Christian and non-theistic religions. But one virtue, I think, of Sri Ramakrishna's religious pluralism is that he actually places theistic and non-theistic paths on an equal footing. The third advantage is what I would call his expansive view of salvation. So this actually, if you've studied Mark Heim, the theologian I just mentioned, his big criticism of one of the major religious pluralists, John Hick, is that John Hick has this kind of one-size-fits-all understanding of religious salvation. He imposes one monolithic conception of salvation onto all the world's religions. So we don't have to go into details, but just keep that in mind. Now, what Sri Ramakrishna, he teaches a religious pluralism that actually accommodates different forms of salvation. So he claims that different religions lead to the same goal of what he calls God realization, but he understands the realization of God in a very capacious way. And he says that different religious practitioners can realize God in very, very different ways. So the Advaita Vedantin can realize God in the form of merging his or her individuality in non-dual pure consciousness, but theistic religious practitioners can attain the same goal of God realization, but in their terms. And their terms would be usually residing in some kind of heaven or some higher loka with the personal God. So he's able, even though he claims that all the different religious paths are leading to the same goal, he understands that goal in a capacious way that accommodates different forms of salvation. And fourth and finally, Sri Ramakrishna's broad conception of the impersonal, personal, infinite reality provides an ontological rationale for active interreligious dialogue. So I'm sure you're aware that all over the world now, there are all sorts of interfaith conferences, et cetera, et cetera. So representatives from different religions come and they talk together. But the big question is, why should we learn about religions other than our own? And I think Sri Ramakrishna gives a compelling answer. The answer has to do with that earlier slide, because he claims that we can learn more about the nature of the infinite God by exposing ourselves to religions other than our own. So for instance, if I'm an Advaita Vedantin and I'm constantly thinking about impersonal, non-dual Brahman, I stand to learn a great deal if I study Christ's teachings, if I study Vaishnavism. Why is that? Because I learn about the personal aspects and forms of the same God that I'm contemplating. And the same goes in the other direction. And so that wraps it up. And if you're interested in more details, please do look at chapters 3 and 4 of my book. And I'd love to hear from you now. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Swami. That was, yeah, brilliant. A really like thoughtful exposition of like an interesting spiritual teacher. And to have that kind of experiential basis for a religious pluralism, it seems to kind of like transcend a lot of the dichotomies that sort of would seem very natural. Impersonal and personal as being opposed. So yeah, thank you so much. And now we can open to questions. So if anyone has a question, you can raise your hand or you can put it in the chat if you would rather. And no question is too simple. So ask away.
Hello. I just wanted to say hi, first of all. Sorry, I was stuck in a class.
Hi, good to see you, Shruti. Yeah, no problem.
Thank you so much for that presentation. That was absolutely amazing. And yeah, I mean, like Sri Ramakrishna is something, like, you know, someone I've heard of growing up, because I mean, like, you know, I grew up in Kolkata until I was 14 years old. But yeah, I was just really interested to hear about these things because I really do know him as very much I mean, pluralism is like an interesting, like, and the way that you've like talked about it in depth is really interesting because I didn't really know about it. I'd love to know more if you want, like, you know, about Ramakrishna and his views on Buddhism. I think you mentioned. So if you could just expand on that, that would be great.
Sure. So I addressed this issue in the last section of chapter 3 of my book, but just in summary. So a number of his visitors, they brought up the Buddha and the Buddha's teachings, and Sri Ramakrishna would ask them. I mean, Sri Ramakrishna didn't read spiritual texts, but often pundits would come to him and teach him about different religious traditions. So he asked them, okay, so what did the Buddha teach? And they kind of told him, and what he said was, look, even though many people think that Buddha was an atheist, he was in fact not an atheist. He realized his own true nature, but he couldn't put it into words. That's the way he put it. So, and he said that his true nature neither is sort of in between asti and nasti. These are the Bengali or Sanskrit words. So you can neither say that it exists or that it doesn't exist. Amir is studying Madhyamaka Buddhism, but I think you'll find resonances with the way that Madhyamaka Buddhism teaches the ontological status of this ultimate reality. But so Sri Ramakrishna, basically his understanding of the Buddha. Now again, I mean, let's be careful here and distinguish the Buddha from Buddhism, which is a kind of their later religious doctrines codified on the basis of his teachings, and there are different interpretations of his teachings. But Sri Ramakrishna never talked about Buddhism, the ISM version of it, but he talked about the Buddha's teachings. And what he claimed is that the Buddha's experience of nirvana was none other than the Advaitic knowledge of non-dual pure consciousness, just in different words. So whereas Advaita Vedantins will explain this pure consciousness in positive terms as Brahman, right? They use positive language, Atman, Brahman. Buddha, he claims, Sri Ramakrishna claims that Buddha instead uses negative language. So and in fact, I mean, Advaita Vedantins will be happy with that negative language. You know, they're also famous for teaching the via negativa and, you know, claiming that Brahman, the highest definition of Brahman is neti neti. It's a phrase that comes from Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. Not this, not this. So, you know, in the same way, Sri Ramakrishna is saying an equally valid way of explaining this pure consciousness is the way that the Buddha does, which is he calls it nirvana. He's saying it's the extinguishing of all suffering. It's the extinguishing of our petty individuality. But what's the positive reality? Well, that's beyond words. You can only be that reality. So that's the basic way that he handles Buddhism, is that he assimilates it, not Buddhism, he assimilates the Buddha's spiritual experience to the spiritual experience of Advaita Vedanta.
Thank you.
I think Ershad had a question, so if you'd like to go.
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Ershad. Well, thank you so much for this lecture. I learned a lot. I have this question. You mentioned about Ramakrishna's mentioning about the Sirguna Brahman as Nirguna and Sirguna Brahman as being the same, but at the same time, Shakti being like the nature is the manifestation of the Brahman. It's a real. So and we know in Advaita Vedanta, especially in Adi Shankara, there is the concept of avidya and the concept of Maya. So, but if the nature is like what we see as the manifestation of the Brahman, it is the true reality, then what happens with the concept of avidya and the concept of Maya?
Yeah, that's a good question. So this goes, I mean, if you read chapter 1 of my book, one of the things I say, before I actually go into explaining Sri Ramakrishna's philosophical teachings and his Vijñana-Vedanta, I claim that we need to first establish some hermeneutic principles. And one of the first ones is this one, that we should be very careful to resist the temptation to impose philosophical concepts, external philosophical concepts, onto his views, right? So you brought up a few terms like avidya, which is the term for ignorance, the Sanskrit term in Advaita Vedanta, and Maya, which is a very, famously Advaitic kind of concept. And you asked an interesting question. So how would Sri Ramakrishna explain these terms? But in my mind, I think that what we should do is when we study Sri Ramakrishna's teachings, we should take them on their own terms. So unless Sri Ramakrishna talks about Maya or avidya, we shouldn't necessarily think that he has any particular view about it, right? Because unless we already assume a priori that he subscribes to Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, we won't be asking that question, right? So he actually has some interesting, he does talk about Maya, but he has a different understanding of Maya from Shankara. So he distinguishes two kinds of Maya, avidya, Maya. So avidya comes in two. Avidya Maya, which is the Maya of ignorance, and Vidya Maya, which is the Maya of knowledge. And he says, but the interesting thing is that he explains this from his own standpoint of Vijñana-Vedanta. And what he says is, these concepts of Maya don't mean that the world is unreal. He says, avidya Maya, the Maya of ignorance, is the Maya that deludes us into focusing on this world and forgetting about God. It makes us forget about God. And Vidya Maya, the Maya of knowledge, and he gives examples. It's, for instance, discrimination, dispassion, devotion toward God, etc., all these things. These are all fall under Vidya Maya. He says that it's through these qualities of Vidya Maya, of the Maya of knowledge, that we can actually attain the highest goal of life, which is God realization. So he also accepts Maya, but he gives it a kind of non-illusionistic twist. So that would be my, and then avidya, he doesn't mean by avidya what Shankara means, which is that this whole world is a product of ignorance. What he says is that we are all, so long as we have not realized God, we're ignorant of God. And what we see instead is this world, and we think that each object in this world is an independently existing object. When we attain knowledge of God, we see the same world, except that we see that every single thing in this world and every single human being is nothing but a real manifestation of the same God. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So it's really interesting in my experience of looking at sort of classical Indian philosophy, which is quite limited. It seems that, like, in terms of religious pluralism, most of the things that I've come across have been in some way inclusivistic, in that they've sort of seen that their own position is the highest, and others are kind of integrated in this sort of supersessionary way. And so, if Ramakrishna has what you say a robustly pluralistic vision, I'm curious to see if there's sort of any sort of influence by modernity, maybe Western modernity, in Ramakrishna himself, because I know that I mean, he talked about the Brahmas in one of the quotes that you gave. And to my understanding, the Brahmas, it refers to the Brahmo Samaj. And I think it was founded by Ram Mohan Roy, who was influenced by Western thinking. So was there any sort of Western influence there in his kind of particular viewpoint?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, this is another kind of controversial scholarly question. And so Brahmo Samaj, you're right, it was founded by Ram Mohan Roy, but then it kind of splintered, and there are many different organizations with different names. So Devendranath Tagore was another one, and then Keshav Chandra Sen developed a later branch of the Brahmo Samaj. And he was one of Sri Ramakrishna's earliest devotees and visitors. And he, at the very time that Keshav Chandra Sen was teaching the harmony of religions, he was also visiting Sri Ramakrishna. And so there's this fierce debate between followers of Keshav, so these Brahmo followers, and then followers of Sri Ramakrishna. And so the followers of Keshav were saying, it was Keshav who taught Sri Ramakrishna the harmony of religions. And then the Ramakrishnites are saying, are you guys crazy? He taught the harmony of religions way back, and his spiritual practices go back way before he met Keshav Chandra Sen. So anyway, I mean, my view on this is that Sri Ramakrishna held the harmony of this doctrine, the harmony of religions, well before he met Keshav. And I think that's pretty clear because all of his spiritual practices were done in the 1860s and early 1870s, before he had met Keshav Chandra Sen. And it was at that time that he was going through one practice after another and finding that they all lead to the same goal. So there's good, I think, historical evidence for the fact that he had taught the harmony of religions independently of Keshav, which could arguably have, he was very strongly influenced by Western trends, as was Ram Mohan Roy. But that's not to say that he didn't maybe, it's possible that he kind of packaged his teachings on the harmony of religions in a certain way in light of the kinds of people that were coming to him with a certain Western education. It's entirely possible. I mean, look, how does he even know about non-Hindu religions, right? At Shankara's time, as I mentioned, he didn't seem to be aware of non-Hindu religions, right? They considered people living outside of India as mlechas, right? There's a very pejorative term, which means these sort of beyond the pale kind of people who aren't Indians, So just the fact that he was living in a time in India which was under British colonial rule, so there's going to be some Western influence. But overall, I think it's worth taking Sri Ramakrishna at face value sometimes. And one of the things that he says over and over again is, everything I'm saying comes directly from the Divine Mother. He says, Mother is telling me to say all these things to you. Everything he's taught was they weren't intellectual theories, they were based on his own spiritual experiences. So as I said, the spiritual experience of Vijñana, but then also the different experiences of God that he had through the different religious practices that he underwent in the course of his life. So I would like to think that he taught the harmony of religions on the basis of his spiritual experiences and just kind of really grounded on an experiential basis. That's what I would say.
Okay, fascinating. So would you see that as a kind of innovation in the kind of history of Indian thought in some way? Like this is perhaps one of the first time or one of the few times that a kind of robust pluralism is articulated.
Yeah, I think it might be. I mean, you probably are aware of Andrew Nicholson's book, Unifying Hinduism. You should look at that. You should look at that because this really kind of tackles this issue. But what Andrew Nicholson is claiming is that a medieval philosopher named Vijñana-Bhikshu, who subscribed to Vedanta, that he was one of the first to theorize Hinduism as a kind of accommodating doctrine that encompasses different religious paths, but in a kind of inclusivistic manner. So he has a whole chapter on doxography. So this is exactly what you're talking about, how when you read earlier Indian thinkers, it's all about kind of hierarchies and sort of, I'm standing at the top of Mount Everest, and you guys are kind of somewhere on the side of it, or maybe at the very bottom, but you're not where I am. There's that kind of hierarchical contest that's going on. And they're all sort of playing the same game, like, no, I'm the highest, you're the highest, I'm the, even Abhinavagupta, you said you were also studying, but he does the same thing. Kashmiri Shaivism has these inclusivist hierarchies. So I think that Sri Ramakrishna is one of the first. I think Keshav Sen is another one, but again, Keshav Sen, what's interesting about, even though he teaches the harmony of religions, I think he's actually guilty of the thing that I mentioned in my presentation, which is that he claims to be a religious pluralist. He doesn't use that term, but he really projects that kind of liberality, but he never accepts Nirguna Brahman. He never accepts the non-dual pure consciousness. He talks about Jnana Yoga, but it's not in the same sense of Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. And I mean, I've studied some of his teachings, but I never see him actually acknowledging the reality of the impersonal dimension of the infinite divine reality in the way that Sri Ramakrishna very explicitly does. So I think his is a kind of inclusivism in disguise, and that arguably Sri Ramakrishna is the first to teach a full-blown religious pluralism in the Hindu context, and possibly in the global context.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you.
If I could just ask, I'd love to know, I mean, if you know about this, talk about Sharda Devi, his wife, who is also a saint and a mystic, and I guess if there are influences of her work in his work or his work in her work, because she also, like, after Sri Ramakrishna's death, she sort of carried on in his stead and a lot of his work as well, and kept in touch with his students, disciples, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it's easy to kind of forget about his spiritual consort, his wife, Sharada Devi. It's, by the way, it was not a worldly marriage in the normal sense. They didn't have any children. But so Sri Ramakrishna, he passed away in 1886. And then before he passed away, he kind of passed on the duty of spiritual ministry to his wife, Sharada Devi, and told her, you need to take over and kind of guide these disciples and create your own disciples. And he gave her mantras to give to her disciples. And for decades following 1886, she initiated thousands of people into the Ramakrishna tradition. And so when you're asked about influence, I mean, obviously because they were husband and wife and he taught her everything that she knew, she was basically teaching, she had a mind of her own too, which is, I mean, and she would often give these teachings, which you don't find as prominently in Sri Ramakrishna. So one of the famous ones is never look at other people's faults, rather look at your own. So this is similar to one of Christ's teachings, and a number of other ones. And what many followers of Sri Ramakrishna say is that the Holy Mother embodies religion in practice, because she led the life of a kind of a typical housewife in a certain way. So she would cut vegetables, she would cook, she would look after her niece named Radhu, and her niece was quite difficult to live with, but she kind of, at the same time, she was always in this kind of spiritual state. And so it's kind of, she's the great example or embodiment of putting religion in a practice, Sri Ramakrishna's teachings in a practice. But she, of course, also fully embraced the harmony of religions. And in fact, Sister Nivedita, who was an Irish disciple of Swami Vivekananda, she came to visit the Holy Mother, and Holy Mother is an Orthodox Brahmin widow at that time, but she welcomed her with open arms, and which was, I mean, kind of unthinkable in that cultural context in her village. But she was very broad-minded. She did the same thing with a Muslim thief, a Muslim robber, who she knew him to be a robber, and she welcomed him and fed him with her own hands. I mean, she had that kind of generosity. Thanks for that question.
Beautiful. I think we have a question from Ayushi Gupta. There's a hand raised, if you want to go ahead.
Hi, so I wanted to ask, I was wondering if you could expand on yours or Sri Ramakrishna's views on the distinction between pluralism and universalism, because isn't this kind of notion of pluralism essentially universalist?
Okay, I mean, that's a good question. What is the difference, or what are the similarities between universalism and pluralism? Again, I mean, as I said about pluralism, the term pluralism has been bandied about for decades, and different theorists mean different things by pluralism. I think the same thing can be said about universalism. And Arvind Sharma, he's a scholar of Hindu studies, and he wrote a book on this issue. I think it's just called Hindu Universalism or something like that. So every chapter he goes through and he looks at how different Hindu thinkers understood universalism. So Rabindranath Tagore, Swami Vivekananda, he's got a chapter I think on Ramakrishna, and so, you know, Brahma Samaj followers. So it depends on what you mean by universalism. So did you have a particular understanding of it? Then we can have something concrete to work with. Or
so I actually, well, I guess the way I see universalism is kind of making like a claim which, so, you know, the claim that all religions are take one to salvation is a kind of universal claim in the sense that, do you see what I mean? It's like I don't know, I feel like at the bottom of it, there is a sense of universalism in making.
Oh, I see. Okay, I mean, in that sense, maybe you're understanding universalism in the sense of like a kind of common core of all religions or something like that. Or like perennialism is another term for this. Aldous Huxley developed a term. And so in that sense, I think that I'd be happy to call Sri Ramakrishna a universalist, because I think that he thought that at the heart of all religions is the same impersonal, personal, infinite divine reality. So there's a kind of ontological common ground at the basis of all the religions, but that, different religious practitioners will call that common ground different names. Some will call it Christ, some God, Allah, some Brahman, some Atman, some Shunyata, some Nirvana. So at that level, I think his religious pluralism is a form of universalism understood in that sense. Does that make sense?
Yep, thank you.
Thanks.
Can you maybe say in what sense he isn't a universalist, perhaps? Is there a sense in which he isn't?
Again, this might go back to that third advantage that I said about his expansive view of salvation. So I think one maybe more like in a normative sense, like some people use the word universalist in a kind of an insult. So like Mark Heim, when he's criticizing John Hick's religious pluralism, his main criticism is that Hick just is not able to, he's a kind of universalist in a bad sense, because he takes the goal of all religions to be knowledge of what he calls the real an sich. He uses this Kantian language to explain this completely unknowable ultimate reality about which nothing can be said. And so Heim says, well, look, in doing that, what you're doing is you're forcing all of the kind of diverse religious traditions and the diverse views of salvation in these different traditions into a common one-size-fits-all kind of mold. And by doing that, you're doing violence to the individuality and uniqueness of the different traditions. So in that sense, I want to say Sri Ramakrishna is not a universalist. So another critic of religious pluralists is Frank Morales, Morales. And he wrote this kind of diatribe against religious pluralists, and he includes Ramakrishna. And he singles out Ramakrishna as the one who kind of like started what he takes to be this incredibly pernicious stereotyping of Hinduism as the view that all religions are the same, and that all religions, so he says that, he uses the mountain metaphor, and he says, it's just stupid and it's just wrong, and it's you're doing an injustice to non-Hindu religion to say that all religions are on the same mountain, going up to the same mountaintop. That's his thing. But that's why I think that third advantage was really worth highlighting, because what I want to say is that Sri Ramakrishna does think that each of us is heading to the same goal. What is the goal? He defines the goal in a really capacious way as just God realization. But as I said earlier in the presentation, he understands that God realization takes different forms in different religions. So it's not universalist in saying that, everybody has to, merge his or her individuality in non-dual Brahman. That's what the Advaita Vedanta will say. He's not a universalist in that sense. He'll say that, no, you can each realize God in the way that you like to think of God. And that's maybe non-universal. That's more kind of like whatever the opposite term for universal, that's more kind of local or particular, or particularist maybe, right?
Yeah, fascinating. Thanks. Do we have any more questions?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just gonna say, well, you like, I don't know if you want to answer this or not, but I imagine that that's a very unpopular opinion, especially today. Well, I guess like, globally, but also like, especially in India. And I guess I was just wondering, like, how, like you're still doing this research and you're, like senior academia educate and you publish a lot. And I guess I'm wondering, like how you got interested into doing Hindu philosophy and how you find doing that research today, and especially this strand of research that kind of pushes against the grain of what's, becoming normative in India right now.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, it's sort of autobiographical, so I can wax autobiographical a bit, I guess. But, I grew up in the US, in Boston, and for a while, from probably around the age of 19, I wanted to be a monk, but I had this kind of vague, my parents are not, they're now devotees of Sri Ramakrishna and Vivekananda, but that was only after I joined. But at the time they were kind of just standard cultural Hindus, I mean, that kind of thing. So they would drag me to temple, I would be bored, and I was kind of agnostic. But at the age of 19, I came across a translation of the Gita, of the Bhagavad Gita, and I was still agnostic, and so I didn't really care about the devotional side of the text, but I loved the idea of attaining a state of transcendental peace, or shanti, that's a Sanskrit word, through renunciation of worldly attachments and pleasures. That was just something that attracted me from an early age. And then when I joined grad school as a PhD student at Berkeley, within one semester, it all kind of coalesced in my mind. I knew that, I'm going to finish my PhD, but then I'm going to move to India and become a sannyasi. And I still hadn't read a word of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings or Vivekananda, which is quite interesting. And it was during my PhD that I discovered the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna and the life and teachings of both Sri Ramakrishna and Vivekananda. And I started studying Indian philosophy more generally. I mean, the book that I started with, as far as I remember, was Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan's 2-volume Indian philosophy that I found really helpful and informative. And then, immediately after getting my PhD, I came out to India. And I went on the six-month spiritual pilgrimage where I visited ashramas throughout the country. Not just Ramakrishna Mission, but in different ashramas. So for instance, the Divine Life Society, I stayed for 3 weeks in Rishikesh and many other, in Sringeri Math, that's Shankara's ashrama. And it was kind of spiritual shopping in a way. And then I settled on the Ramakrishna Mission just because their particular teachings really resonated the most with me. And I felt that, you see, one thing about the Bhagavad Gita, I don't know how many of you have studied the Gita, but one of the keynotes of the Bhagavad Gita is follow your swabhava or swadharma, your own law of being. That's Sri Aurobindo's beautiful translation of swadharma. He says you should follow your own law of being, and if you do, and you do the work that's allotted to you in a selfless manner, that's the quickest path to salvation. And I thought about that, and I thought more, and I said, you know what? I just spent like half my life studying. It was German philosophy, actually. My kind of doctoral work was in German aesthetics, actually. But I said, how can I kind of harness that sort of those packets of energy and use it to further my own spiritual life? And I thought the best way to do that is to transition from German philosophy and toward Indian philosophy, Vedanta, my own spiritual tradition, and the rest is history. So since then, that was the moment I joined here as a monk and as an academic here at the university, I decided, you know what? I want to make the most of my academic work. So let me kind of make my academic work dovetail with my spiritual life. So my work itself becomes a kind of spiritual practice, a kind of meditation on Sri Ramakrishna and Vivekananda. And I do feel blessed that I'm able to do that, and I'm given scope to do that in my order. In terms of your question about how I deal with controversies, and it's funny here because I'm one of the only I'm an Indian American, right? So ethnically Indian, but here in India, but as an American. And so it's just very different culturally for me. And one of the things that's striking about Indian culture, but also about especially monks, maybe in our order, but in other orders too, is that Sankara has enormous cultural prestige. Shankaracharya, the codifier of Advaita Vedanta. And when you go against the orthodox Shankaran philosophy, that raises a lot of eyebrows, and fortunately I feed off that kind of energy, that kind of pushback. So that's all. I'm happy that I'm doing that. And the greatest insult to a scholar is indifference, in my view. So if I'm making people furious, then I think I'm doing something right. That would be maybe the short answer to your question.
So yeah, that's really quite funny. I guess like that's leads on to like another question I had about language. Were you familiar with any Indian languages, or did you have to learn from scratch? Because honestly,
that's a great question. So I am Bengali, and so I spoke Bengali at home in Boston. And from age 6 to age 12, my parents would take me to Bedford. And there was a kind of makeshift informal Bengali school on Sundays. It was a Bengali Sunday school taught by Bengali parents, because there were lots of Bengali families in Boston at the time. So I'm very grateful to these early Bengali teachers of mine. I learned to read and write Bengali. And obviously I wasn't fluent. But it was good enough that the moment I came here and became a monk, I was able to kind of read Sri Ramakrishna's teachings in the original Bengali, but slowly, and then with practice, I would read it every day. And then living in Kolkata for so many years, I became better at it. But so I had Bengali as my mother tongue, sort of, but I was able to practice that once I moved out here. And regarding Sanskrit, I was a Fulbright scholar for my 4th year as a PhD student, and I was in Germany, in Berlin, working on Hegel and Kant and Heidegger. But when I came back, I had 2 more years left of my PhD program. And I work on intuition a lot of times. So in this case, something in me told me, you have to learn Sanskrit now. It's now or never. And then I looked into it and I found, wait a minute, Berkeley has an over 100-year-old Sanskrit program. And I learned Sanskrit for 2 years, the last 2 years of so 4 semesters of Sanskrit. And fortunately for me, there's a husband and wife couple who are both Sanskrit professors. They're Robert Goldman and Sally Goldman. And they had written one of the authoritative Sanskrit textbooks called Devavani Praveshika. And she taught me Sanskrit for 2 years. So I got this kind of world-class Sanskrit teacher to teach me Sanskrit. So that gave me the linguistic foundation for then doing proper work in Indian philosophy.
That's so interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, I see it all as, now that I'm a monk, I can say that I see it all as the divine will. Put it that way.
I have a question actually about, so sort of leading on from this discussion. So it's interesting that you say that your academic work kind of follows on from your spiritual life, but do you sort of see that going in the other direction as well? Is there a way in which your life as a monk and your spiritual practice kind of affects the way you do academia and the way that you sort of see academia?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yes, and I mean, one of the greatest dangers of academic work and academic life is ego. I mean, it's true of every field, but there's a special danger of ego when you're lording it over students and you're kind of telling them like it is, and it can easily be this top-down relationship where you're like, I know things, you guys are idiots. With research, it's even worse because then you become caught in this kind of frenzy of I need to publish in the most prestigious journals, and oh, my colleague he's so much dumber than I am, but why is he getting more recognition than me? Why was he invited to contribute to this journal and not me? And like, you can easily get caught up in that stuff. For that reason, actually, toward the end of my PhD, I was so disgusted with academic life. I told my guru, I'd just been initiated by my guru, and he said, well, look, you just got your PhD. The best thing to do is to teach in a college or university in India as a monk. I said, I'd rather sweep floors than do academic work. That's what I told him at the time. And then interestingly, after that kind of 6-month pilgrimage, my whole view turned around, and I thought more about the Gita's teachings, the kind of wisdom of following your own law of being. But anyway, with regard to the question, the direct answer is that, since I've been doing my academic work here at the university as a monk, what I'm trying to do, and again, to what extent I've succeeded is another question altogether, and that's only God knows. But what I'm trying to do is do the same academic work I would do, let's say, as a normal non-monastic in an ordinary university, except in a selfless way. I mean, that's what karma yoga means in the Gita and then in Hindu traditions in general. You can do whatever you're doing. You can be a husband, you can be an academic, you can be a lawyer, you can be a doctor, but it's the spirit in which you do it that matters. It's the quality of heart that matters. So are you doing it for name and fame? Are you doing it to spite someone? Are you doing it to, so et cetera, et cetera. There are many different reasons for doing it. Are you doing it to make money? Or are you doing it as a service to the Lord? Are you doing it to help mankind or to serve mankind, right? So karma yoga means you try to do everything you do, you try to divinize it or you try to spiritualize it by giving it a kind of spiritual turn, by purifying the motivation behind the work that you're doing. So I'm doing the same academic work, but I try to do it as an offering to the Lord, and I try to do it in a less egoistic manner than I otherwise would have. Maybe that would be the way I'd put it.
Yeah, okay, beautiful. I mean, I've been going through sort of very similar thought processes recently. Like, I'm thinking of taking a year out. I just watched a Ram Dass documentary recently, and it made me really think that, like, there's so much kind of like direct experience to explore, and academia is kind of limited. But maybe that makes me so sorry if other people have questions. I mean, I could just keep talking. But it makes me think that well, how do you think of the difference between sort of intellectual knowledge and sort of spiritual direct knowledge? And do you sort of see them as leading to each other, as like academic knowledge can perhaps be in some way a distraction from spiritual knowledge? How do you think
anything can be a distraction, and anything can also be a help, I mean, in my opinion. So it just, again, it depends on the spirit with which you do it. what Sri Ramakrishna would say is that a pandit or an intellectual who doesn't have viveka and vairagya, who doesn't have discrimination and dispassion, he doesn't qualify as a pandit at all. So he would say that a true intellectual is somebody who, one thing that struck me when, and I'm not going to name names in this context, but one thing you'll find when you meet really, really world famous intellectuals, you guys are at Oxford, so I don't need to even tell you guys about it, but is that they can be, intellectual powerhouses, but they're not necessarily the best people. And to me, that just feels like and I felt that really deeply about myself. I'm not just talking about others. I mean, part of the reason why I moved away from a purely academic but secular life where, I'd just be doing the same stuff as everybody else, and I became a monk is because my first book is based on my PhD thesis, but it was on German aesthetics. And one of the sentences it's the very last sentence of the introduction is this, it's art, it's about art, right? But what does art do for us? And I said that art at its most sublime registers the pathos of the distance between who we are and who we might be. Art at its most sublime registers the pathos of the distance between who we are and who we might be. So to me, the reason why I was so invested in art and philosophy in the first place was because it made me felt really acutely and distressingly how far from the ideal I really was. And that one of the things that kind of worldly ideology does, this is why I loved Adorno so much, is because Adorno is really good on explaining this. One of the things about like just capitalism and kind of worldly ideology in general is that it closes that gap. It makes you think that the status quo is perfect and that what you are is good enough, So it's art that kind of held apart who I am from what I could be. And then that kind of opened the door to my spiritual life, because then I said, you know what, now the next step is I need to strive to become what I want to be, yeah.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you. I sort of find in myself that like the more I do academic work, it's like if someone asks me like a question about religion or about spirituality or about these things that I'm studying, it's like I have two brains in which I could answer. I can answer as the academic who sort of has read about like Buddhist meditation, or I can answer as the practitioner of Buddhist meditation. So in that way, I've kind of felt a level of separation between the two.
Yeah, I think that now there's a kind of new trend. New trend means maybe in the past 10 years or so. There's a new trend of the scholar practitioner with the hyphen in between. And the whole aim of that is to kind of bridge that felt divide or that kind of schizophrenia, where you don't feel that, you're two different people when in these two, where you're wearing two different hats, but that there's one hat and that you're able to do both equally well. I mean, that's a kind of regulative ideal, but I think that's something that I certainly strive toward. And I think more and more people are doing that or trying to, and they're seeing the value of it more and more. So I think in the past, people in theology and religious studies and philosophy, they kind of felt that if you were a practitioner of a particular religion, that actually kind of makes you disqualified to be an objective scholar. But I think that's like slowly that prejudice is fading away. And in fact, the opposite is becoming more true. I mean, I think that there's a danger of the other extreme, which is kind of identity politics, which is that, if you can only understand African philosophy if you're Black, or Indian philosophy if you're Indian, or, you're only allowed to talk about trans issues if you're trans yourself. And I don't endorse that other extreme, but I think that goes too far. But there's a middle ground to be had, which I think is really valuable.
I think you do get these really beautiful moments where you're able to sort of use academia to kind of express yourself like in a sort of more authentic way.
Yeah, I think that's right, exactly. And you have to be careful and skillful about it. You don't want to be too heavy-handed in your kind of the spiritual side. There's a way of doing it, which, I'm still getting the hang of it, but I think it can be done and it should be done because it's very valuable.
I think Ersha had another question. Maybe I'll just read it out. He put it in the chat. So he says, I have one more question if there's time. How do you feel about the rise of Hindu nationalism and Hindu violence in India? How do you struggle with this as a spiritual person when you see spirituality used as politics and a tool of hatred? I studied Hindu philosophy in India. I personally was so shocked from what I saw. I'm wondering what your experience of it is.
Yeah, that's a great question. If you're interested, I wrote an article on this recently. last year. It's called "Was Swami Vivekananda a Hindu Supremacist?" Revisiting a long-standing debate. And so one of the interesting things about the RSS, which is one of these Hindu nationalist organizations in India, Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister, belongs to RSS. They consider Swami Vivekananda to be one of the spokespeople, or one of the main. I mean, when you walk into an RSS meeting, I've never done that, but what I've heard is that there's often or usually a giant picture of Swami Vivekananda, and I think that's not fair to Vivekananda. I think that what they're doing is appropriating Vivekananda's statements about Hinduism and kind of, well, misappropriating, kind of decontextualizing him and his statements about Hinduism. He was speaking at a time of British colonialism. And the kinds of things he was saying were very much, I mean, they can only be understood within the context of British colonialism. So that's part of what I'm claiming in my article. So yeah, I mean, I feel very strongly about this precisely because I'm a monk of the Ramakrishna order founded by Swami Vivekananda, who has been regularly and I think erroneously appropriated by right-wing Hindu organizations. Yeah, I think that's obviously wrong and it shouldn't be done. Yeah, the whole purpose of my presentation today and my discussion with you today is to encourage you to see the positive side of, I mean, it's not even just the positive side of Hinduism, but what I consider to be true Hinduism, which is far more ecumenical in spirit. And I don't want to say that all Hindus are religious pluralists because I think that would be monolithic and that would be wrong. But most Hindus are at least inclusivistic. I mean, there are not many who are just like extreme exclusivists, and even fewer who are fanatically Hindu. I mean, I haven't met many, to be honest. So, you know, Hindu nationalism, one thing about it is that I find that Hindu nationalists, I mean, I put Hindus in quotes there, they're the least Hindu. You know, they're more just, they understand Hindu in more of a cultural rather than a religious sense. So I just don't even see them as kind of, you know, you ask them, what's your religion? They're not going to, you know, they're not going to give you a coherent religious answer to the question. They're going to say that India is the greatest. And, you know, I mean, that's not a religious point to make.
Yeah, thank you for that. So it's kind of gone 12:30, so I think we'll sort of call an end to the discussion group there. So thank you so much for speaking, and thanks guys for showing up. Yeah,
this was a lot of fun. Thanks so much. Yeah, I really enjoyed it.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks guys.